Good morning, it's Hazel Jarvis, it's Art Online, and today we are going to do a tomato chart. We're going to do an heirloom tomato chart with watercolor and collage. So hopefully you've all done the exercise and you have the preliminary chart. So now we're going to actually do a quick drawing and then we will start to get painting. I'm going to do a light pencil study so that I know where my tomatoes are going to go. So I dip my brush into clean water. I dip it into my paint. I'm using number 43, which is a lovely warm yellow color. And I start with the first tomato, just up here. And I put the paintbrush just down to the edge, and then I slowly pull the paint all around my tomato, but I want to leave a little bit of white space for a highlight because the tomato is nice and shiny. And then I gradually pull that yellow down, and then when I get to about 3/4 of the way, I'm going to take another color, in this case my orange, my vermilion, 31, and I'm just going to start bleeding some of that color in. And look at how beautifully the paint flows when one wet paint meets another. And you just gently, gently stroke all that paint down into the bottom of your tomato. And there is your first tomato. So we move on to tomato number 2. We can't work on this one because it's touching the wet paint. So we'll start with this nice guy over here. We're going to take a different color. I'm going to take my yellow 42. I'm going to start in the same way up towards the left, pulling the paint around, but leaving that highlight up in the corner. Dragging the paint down, just slowly pulling it, and then bleeding in another color. In this case, I'm doing a green 53. And I like to end just in my lower right-hand corner, just a little bit darker, so that gives the tomato an illusion of roundness and volume. Like so. So I'm consciously varying my color choices and my shapes as I fill in. Where we have tomatoes touching, like here and here and here, we have to wait for everything to dry before we can paint those in. Otherwise the colors are just going to bleed and run. So we have to take a moment and wait, but fear not, no downtime. Because we're going to be using a little bit of collage, this is your opportunity to scout around the studio or the house and find some paper that you can paint on. So I'm taking this from an old catalogue, and you want paper, if you possibly can, that has this sort of dry texture. You don't want anything too slick or too shiny. You take your watercolor, and not too wet, but you're just going to paint over the text, just like I'm doing now. And you can just vary it, bleed in a little bit of extra color, and paint a little bit more than you think you're going to need, because this is going to be used on the side, the dark side of the tomato, and possibly even for a stem or a leaf if you want to paint some green. So this is my paint going in, and I set that aside to dry for a few minutes. Here's a little bit of sort of mossy green that I might want to use for a stem or a leaf. So I'm just going to paint it. Other elements that you might want to use are brown paper, if you have it any around. Excellent. Again, one of these catalogues that has the nice matte paper. So your chart now looks something like this, and actually all the hard work is done. We've filled in the basket. We still have to fill in that little white space, but that's no big deal. I've smudged here, but I try not to beat myself up about this because I know that that's where my signature is going to go. And if you do smudge, you can always add a leaf or you can add some splatter, so don't despair. So at this point, we're ready to add the decoration and we're ready to paint a second layer on top of some, maybe not all of our tomatoes. These tomatoes have a lovely stripe. They're a bit like a tiger tomato or tiger tomato. You'll see I'm bilingual, tomato, tomato. And we're going to add some of those stripes in, and we're going to consciously make them fatter as they go down. Thin at the top, fatter at the bottom, to give our tomato some volume. So this round guy looks like a good candidate for the striping treatment. While the paint is still wet, I'm going to get just a little bit more pigment on my brush, a mix of 30 and 31, and just tuck it in at the very base so it's just slightly darker. Just a tiny, tiny tad, smoothing out that edge, and that gives it this lovely glow and this lovely feeling of roundness. Striping, but this green one is gorgeous, too good to resist, so I'm going to do the same treatment on this guy up here. Going back to my green, combination of 51 and 53, I start in the same way. I start near the top on the left-hand side, and I start thin, and as I go, I pull it round so that I give the illusion of the tomato being round. I want some of the strokes to look as they're originating from the top where the stem is. So I put in just a couple just at the top. And I'm going to add a tiny bit of indigo to the stripes at the bottom, just to darken them up a little bit. We'll add just one or two thin stripes to this guy. And some stripes to this one in the basket. And finally to our monster over here. But this one is going to be slightly less stripes and more just a little bit of shaping. So stage 2 is now done. You have your basic color and you have some stripes. So now it's time to add the stem. So on your paper towel, you knock off a little bit of extra paint to make sure that you have a nice point. And then you just stroke in the stem. And then you add a couple of these. And you start on the very tip of your brush, and then you press down for more weight to get a thicker line, and then you pull in. And I want a couple going across my tomato. And there we have one of them. When we go to the next tomato, we want to consciously avoid having the same placement. So instead of having the stem actually at the edge of the tomato, we're going to have it in the middle of the tomato. So we will put it right here. And again, we do the same thing very carefully. And because we're going darker over the red, I just paint on top, right on top of that first layer of colour. Grab a little bit more paint. have your second stem. So because we're adding a little bit of collage, I'm going to cut out my next stem from this little scrap of brown paper, but purely optional. You can do it all in watercolor if you wish. You can draw your stem arrangement, but I don't usually bother. I usually just cut and aim for kind of a starfish pattern. So first the starfish, then the stem, and then I take my pencil and I just add a tiny bit of shadow just on one side and at the base of the stem, just like that. So here is our painting, and we've just completed the third stage. We've added the stems. We've got the stems in brown paper. We've got them in painted paper with text, and we have a little bit from the catalogue. And where I had the awful smudge down here, I just used a little bit of painted page to create a leaf. I tucked in a tiny bit more painted paper right here and over here and just down here. And now you're finished and you have a beautiful heirloom tomato chart. You just need to sign it. If you wish, you can add text. So thank you so much for joining me, and I look forward to seeing what you do.